Welcome back to Theosophy and Beyond, where we explore the challenging terrain of spiritual awakening through archetypal wisdom. I'm your host, Zero Hakathos, and today we're diving deep into a teaching that came through Lilith, that primal feminine force who represents the untamed aspect of consciousness, the rejection of false authority, and the courage to walk paths that others fear to travel. Lilith is often portrayed as the dangerous first woman who refused to submit to Adam's authority and was cast out of Eden for her defiance. But what if her true role isn't destruction, but navigation? What if she's not leading us astray, but rather teaching us how to discern our way through landscapes where madness and sanity intermingle, where conventional transportation systems fail us, and where we must learn to trust our own inner guidance even when the journey seems impossible? Today's vision reveals Lilith's wisdom about spiritual autonomy, discernment between functional and dysfunctional consciousness, and the recognition that sometimes the most important work awaits us precisely in the directions that seem most uncertain. This is Gnosis about learning to fly with our own wings while also knowing when to walk the earth with practical wisdom. The vision began with me gliding awkwardly in the air before landing next to a desert highway. This initial image contains the entire teaching in compressed form. The attempt to transcend ordinary consciousness through spiritual practice. The awkwardness that characterizes early stages of consciousness expansion, and the inevitable return to ground-level reality where the real work must be done. The awkward gliding represents what happens when we first begin to experience expanded states of consciousness. We get glimpses of what it feels like to move beyond ordinary awareness, to operate from higher perspectives, to transcend the limitations of ground-bound thinking. But these early experiences are typically unstable, uncontrolled, and brief. We can't yet sustain flight. We haven't yet mastered the spiritual aerodynamics that would allow smooth navigation of expanded states. This awkwardness is completely normal and necessary. Lilith teaches us not to be frustrated by the instability of early spiritual experiences, but to appreciate them as learning opportunities. Each awkward flight teaches us something about the conditions required for sustained expansion of consciousness. The landing next to a desert highway reveals where the real spiritual work occurs, not in transcendent flights above ordinary reality, but in the stark, unforgiving landscape of actual human experience. The desert represents the stripped-down environment where illusions are burned away and only essential truths remain. The highway suggests a path of spiritual progress, but one that requires walking rather than flying. In practical terms, this opening sequence teaches several crucial lessons about balancing transcendent spiritual experiences with grounded daily practice. We need both the inspiration that comes from expanded states and the discipline that comes from consistent earthbound work. The goal isn't to escape ordinary consciousness, but to transform it through regular contact with expanded awareness. A baby blue bus was pulled over on the road where I landed, but I didn't get on. It pulled away, leaving me to continue on foot. This bus represents conventional spiritual transportation, the established religious and spiritual institutions that promise to carry seekers toward enlightenment or salvation. The baby blue color suggests these institutions offer gentle, nurturing approaches that appeal to those seeking comfort and easy answers. But the crucial detail is my choice not to board despite the opportunity. This represents the Lilith principle of spiritual autonomy, the recognition that authentic transformation requires walking our own path rather than being passively transported by external authorities. The bus pulling away after I declined to board shows that conventional spiritual institutions don't wait for those who choose independent paths. They have schedules to maintain, routes to follow, groups to serve. They can't accommodate the individual timing and unique needs of souls called to walk their own way. This rejection of convenient spiritual transportation represents one of the most challenging aspects of authentic spiritual development. The recognition that we must ultimately take responsibility for our own journey rather than relying on institutions, teachers, or systems to carry us to enlightenment. The practical application involves honestly examining our relationship with spiritual institutions and authorities. Are we using them as genuine support for our individual development, or are we hoping they'll do the hard work of transformation for us? Lilith teaches that while external guidance can be valuable, the actual journey of consciousness expansion must be walked with our own feet, navigated with our own inner guidance. As I walked along the highway, I encountered 4 men, alternating between states of madness and sanity. The sequence reveals Lilith's teaching about discernment, the crucial ability to distinguish between functional and dysfunctional expressions of consciousness, especially when conventional social markers aren't available to guide us. The first man was clearly insane, ignoring my presence while obsessively asking the second man for yogurt over and over again. This represents consciousness trapped in repetitive loops, unable to engage with present reality, fixated on obtaining something that may or may not be available. The yogurt represents some form of nourishment or comfort that the insane consciousness believes it needs but can't obtain through its dysfunctional approach. The second man seems sane, and when he spots me, we both laugh at the first man. The shared laughter represents the recognition between functional consciousness, the ability to perceive dysfunction clearly without being drawn into it, and the relief that comes from finding someone else who can see situations accurately. This laughter isn't cruel mockery, but rather the spontaneous response that occurs when 2 aware beings recognize absurdity together. It's the kind of knowing humor that emerges when we can see patterns of dysfunction clearly enough to find them amusing rather than threatening. The third man was also insane, talking to himself and not seeming to notice my presence. This represents another form of dysfunctional consciousness, the internal dialogue that becomes so consuming that it prevents awareness of external reality. Unlike the first man's outward fixation, this represents inward obsession that creates equal isolation from present moment awareness. The fourth man was sane, standing beneath an underpass, a liminal space between above and below, between the highway of progress and whatever lies beyond it. He asks the crucial question, "Why have you come?" And when I shrug, unable to articulate my purpose, he provides essential guidance. There's work in the direction you're headed. The alternating pattern of madness and sanity, insane, sane, insane, sane, reveals one of Lilith's most practical teachings about navigating spiritual and social landscapes. In any environment where consciousness exists in various stages of development and functionality, we'll encounter this mixed pattern. Our task isn't to avoid the insane or only associate with the sane, but to develop the discernment that allows us to recognize which is which and respond appropriately to each. The practical application is profound. In our families, workplaces, spiritual communities, and social circles, we constantly encounter this alternating pattern. Some people are functioning from clear, present awareness. Others are trapped in repetitive mental loops or consuming internal dialogues that prevent genuine connection. Lilith teaches us to judge these differences, but to recognize them clearly so we can engage appropriately with each level of consciousness we encounter. Avoid getting pulled into dysfunctional mental patterns while maintaining compassion for those trapped in them. Find allies among those who can clearly see and share accurate perception of situations. Maintain our own sanity by not taking responsibility for fixing others' mental dysfunctions. The shared laughter with the second man represents the relief and validation that comes from finding others who can perceive reality clearly. This recognition between functional consciousness is essential for maintaining our own psychological and spiritual health while navigating mixed environments. The encounter with the fourth man beneath the underpass represents the culmination of Lilith's teaching. Standing in this liminal space, neither fully on the highway nor completely off it, he asks the fundamental question that all spiritual seekers must eventually face. Why have you come? My inability to articulate a clear answer, responding with a shrug, represents the honest confusion that often characterizes authentic spiritual seeking. Unlike ego-driven spiritual pursuits that have clear goals and expectations, genuine spiritual calling often feels more like following an inner compass towards something we can't yet name or define. This honest admission of uncertainty, rather than fabricating a purpose to appear spiritually sophisticated, demonstrates the kind of humble authenticity that Lilith values. She doesn't require us to have everything figured out before we begin walking. She only requires us to be honest about our actual state of knowing and not knowing. The man's response, "There's work in the direction you're headed," provides the essential guidance that allows the journey to continue with confidence. This represents the kind of practical spiritual direction that confirms we're on the right path, even when we can't see the destination clearly. This work isn't necessarily career or volunteer activity, but rather the spiritual service that emerges naturally when we follow our authentic inner calling. It's the recognition that genuine spiritual seeking always leads toward some form of service, some way of contributing to the evolution of consciousness through our unique gifts and perspective. What makes this specifically a Lilith teaching is the integration of three crucial spiritual capacities: the ability to access expanded states, awkward flying; the willingness to do ground level work, walking the highway; and the discernment to navigate mixed environments, recognizing sanity and insanity. Lilith consciousness doesn't reject any of these capacities, but rather teaches us to use each appropriately. Sometimes we need to access expanded perspectives through meditation, ritual, or mystical practice. Sometimes we need to walk the practical path of daily spiritual discipline and service. And always we need the discernment to recognize functional versus dysfunctional expressions of consciousness in ourselves and others. The practical integration involves developing what we might call spiritual navigation skills. Balanced practice, combining transcendent experiences with grounded daily work, neither getting lost in mystical flights nor becoming trapped in purely material concerns. Autonomous choosing, making conscious decisions about which spiritual buses to board and which to let pass by, based on our individual development needs rather than social expectations. Pattern recognition, learning to quickly identify functional versus dysfunctional consciousness patterns in various environments and respond appropriately to each. Purpose clarification, being honest about our current level of understanding while remaining open to guidance about the work that awaits us. Community discernment, finding and connecting with others who can perceive reality clearly while maintaining compassion for those struggling with various forms of mental and spiritual dysfunction. Lilith's teaching through this vision ultimately concerns the development of individual spiritual authority, the capacity to navigate our own path with wisdom, discernment, and authentic purpose. The desert highway represents the sometimes stark and challenging terrain of independent spiritual seeking, while the alternating encounters with functional and dysfunctional consciousness represents the mixed environment we must learn to navigate skillfully. The refusal to board the conventional bus demonstrates Lilith's core principle. Authentic spiritual development requires taking responsibility for our own journey rather than depending on external authorities to transport us to enlightenment. This doesn't mean rejecting all guidance or community, but rather maintaining ultimate authority over our own spiritual choices and direction. The awkward flying abilities represent our capacity for transcendent experience, while the ground walking represents our commitment to practical spiritual work. The discernment between sanity and insanity represents the crucial skill of recognizing functional versus dysfunctional expressions of consciousness in all the environments we traverse. Together, these elements create a complete curriculum in spiritual autonomy, the ability to walk our own path while maintaining connection with others who can see clearly, to access expanded states while remaining grounded in practical service, and to follow our authentic calling even when we can't fully articulate our ultimate purpose. The question for each of us is, are we ready to develop the kind of spiritual independence that Lilith represents? Can we learn to fly with our own wings while also walking our own path? And ultimately, can we develop the discernment that allows us to navigate between functional and dysfunctional consciousness while maintaining our own clarity and direction? The desert highway stretches ahead, stark but filled with possibility. The work awaits in the direction we're headed. The question is whether we're willing to trust our own navigation abilities enough to keep walking, even when the destination remains unclear. Thank you for joining me in exploring Lilith's teachings about spiritual autonomy and navigation. I encourage you to examine your own relationship with the spiritual authority, to practice discernment in mixed consciousness environments, and to trust your own inner guidance even when you can't fully articulate your ultimate purpose. Until the next time, remember, the most authentic spiritual path is the one you walk with your own feet, guided by your own inner compass.